Rebecca Shaw. Hi. So as Barbara said, I'm going to talk at length about differentia, which are a crowdsourced field, but they were never standardized. So just in case you need a refresher, this is what I'm talking about, these termination formulas for the psalm recitations. When Ruth Steiner designed the Cantus manuscript database in the 1980s at the Catholic University of America, one of her impetuses for its creation was the study of differentiae. However, beyond the production of tonaries as parts of printed manuscript indices, studies that utilize the Cantus database to investigate differentiae are limited. Moreover, there are relatively few studies that examine differentiae beyond the scope of a few manuscripts, regardless of whether the scholar took advantage of Cantus. The reason for the relative shortage of differentiae studies is simple. The differentiae field was crowdsourced, completed for each manuscript index, independent of other indices. Thus, the differentiae names are unique to each manuscript or small group of manuscripts, making cross-manuscript comparison cumbersome. Reflecting on the comparison of differentiae in Piacenza 65 and two geotemporally related tonaries, Merkley and Matthews stated that the task was time-consuming and prohibitively clumsy, taking half a week to compare one pair of tonaries. Although computational query times have decreased remarkably in the 17 years since their article, and we are no longer working with mainframe computers and hole punch cards, and any extensive comparison of differentiae across more than one manuscript remains prohibitively clumsy. The solution, or so we hope, is standardization. Over the past 3 decades, several scholars, including Ruth Steiner, Matthews and Merkley, Joseph Dyer, and Keith Falconer, have discussed the problematic naming of differentiae with regards to multi-manuscript comparison. At the same time, however, some have questioned the feasibility and desirability of standardization for this particular melodic gesture. The differentiae index that I created over the past year, which currently has over 1,400 unique patterns across 100 manuscripts, indicates that it is feasible, although very time-consuming. As for desirability, those scholars who question this seem to want standardization as a time-saving element, even as they state that it would not be desirable given the variation between differentiae in different manuscripts. While there are many differentiae patterns that are specific to a single manuscript, there are also many that appear in more than one manuscript, and the unique differentiae are sometimes closely related to more common differentiae. Therefore, I would contest that while a standardized differentiae index may not have been feasible in the past, it is most certainly feasible and desirable today. If we look at the distribution of differentiae patterns within the octomodal system, we can see that each mode has a similar distribution of differentiae, with a group of patterns that are particular to individual manuscripts, some that are common to a few manuscripts, and a few that are predominant across most manuscripts. The reason for this type of distribution is merely conjecture at this point, as it would require more in-depth analysis than is possible in Excel, where I'm currently storing all of the data. But it may point to some kind of familial relationship between differentiae, where there are certain main configurations of the termination formula, and then versions that are related to varying degrees to the former. While this is speculation at this point, it is speculation that would not be possible without standardization. So to that end, we now turn to the details of the standardization project. When determining the method of standardization, the overarching goal was and is to create an index that enables cross-manuscript research and which will be as useful as possible to as many different researchers and research questions as possible. In order to achieve this objective, 2 things have to happen. First, the standardized identification system should not act as a form of analysis upon the differentiae. And secondly, the index should have multiple access points, or ways of grouping the differentiae. The first requirement is necessary because, if one performed analysis upon the differentiae while indexing, one could omit data that may be useful to another researcher, and more broadly, by simultaneously analyzing and indexing, one implies an interpretation to the data that may be preemptive. The second requirement enables greater access to the data by attempting to capture all possible facets of a differentia, and subsequently enabling various research inquiries. Thus, in its current configuration in Excel, Each differencia has the following fields: a Volpiano transcription, alphabetic transcription of the pitches, pitch contour, that is with pitch repetition removed, the number of pitches, mode, which can be either octomodal or Roman, range, intervallic contour, and indications as to whether it is transposed and whether it includes liquescence. Some of these fields must be manually entered, for example, the Volpiano transcription, the transposition, and the mode, and others can be set to autofill using repeating Excel formulas. For example, the number of pitches, range, intervallic contour, and pitch contour are all autofill fields. As well as providing multiple access points, a standardized index requires a standardized unique identifier for each discrete entry. In the Diferencia index, although each differencia is unique, the Volpiano transcription cannot serve as the unique identifier because some differencia are used in more than one mode, resulting in the same Volpiano transcription appearing more than once in the index. For instance, the same pattern, which you see on this screen, appears in modes 3, 5, 8, and a Roman mode, GC, depending on which manuscript you are looking at. As such, an artificial naming system has to be imposed upon the differencia. At the moment, it has changed several times, the naming system consists of an alphanumeric code which groups the differencia according to pitch contour. The alphabetic suffix to the number captures differences in pitch repetition, mode, grouping, and liquescence, and transposed versions are indicated by the T prefix. For instance, 143D is a transposed version of 143D, whose pitch contour is DED-CBA. There are currently 31 variations of the number 143 pitch contour, 7 of which are transposed. Most of these are in mode 7, with 2 in a Roman mode. The majority are 7 or 8 pitches long, and one form of the contour is much more common than the others, appearing in 86 of 100 sources. While one can analyze the differencia based on these artificial pitch contour subsets, it is important to remember that this is not the only way of approaching differencia, nor is contour necessarily the most inherent grouping criteria for differencia. Determining this requires an analysis of differencia networks based on a variety of factors across a large data set, which this index will enable, but which was not possible at the time of its conception. Moreover, the parameters of similarity are mutable and dependent upon the research question. Similar could mean differencia of the same mode. It could mean differencia with the same final, differencia with a particular 3-note grouping, or anything else you might dream up as a researcher. By providing multiple access points to the data set, the index does not limit inquiry to that defined by the unique identifier. The unique identifier is essentially just a way of differentiating between all of the unique instances. So the process by which I add manuscripts to my master Excel index is as follows. So first, I gather all of the resources that I need together. So the images, the manuscript index, and the differencia table, which was created by the original indexer, if it is available, or if they even created one. Then, after sorting the manuscript index by mode and differencia, I check a minimum of 5 occurrences, if there are 5, of each differencia against the manuscript to catch potential errors and to assess the detail to which the indexer defined each differencia, which I will discuss later. Then I created a table for each manuscript with an image of each differencia from the manuscript, its Volpiano transcription, and the original differencia code, which is used in the Cantus database. Once completed, I check the Volpiano transcriptions for each differencia against the master Excel spreadsheet. If the differencia already exists in the table, I add the differencia ID for the manuscript to the appropriate row and column. If the differencia is new, I add it to the Excel table with the appropriate metadata. Finally, I cross-reference the standardized code for each differencia created in the master differencia table back to the individual manuscript table to complete that circle. And thus, we create a standardized index of differencia. So this is just a very small snapshot of what is a very large Excel spreadsheet, but you can sort of see that some of the differencia appear in multiple manuscripts, some of them just in one, etc. So of course, the process of creating a standardized differencia index is not without its issues. So first, I encountered the Roman modal system in a 12th century antiphonor from St. Peter's in Rome. Previously, I had been using the octomodal system as the primary means of grouping differentiae for the standardized ID, modeling the differentiae index after the organization of medieval tonaries. However, this system does not work with earlier chant traditions because it is predicated on the octomodal system. Although some Roman mode differentiae align with those from octomodal manuscripts, not all do, and Roman modes are not easily equated with modes 1 through 8. Therefore, I removed mode as the primary method of organization, changed it to pitch contour, and entered each Roman mode differentia as a separate line on the Excel table, just as I would for two differentiae in the octomodal system that were identical apart from their modal designation. Another issue to consider is that differentiae sometimes appear in abbreviated form. For these cases, if the full version of the differentia also appears in the same manuscript, I entered the latter in the differentiae index with a note indicating that it also appears in a shortened form. However, in some instances, a differentia only appears in an abbreviated form. Rather than predicting what its complete version might be, which would be an interpretation of the data and not the data itself, I entered the differentia as it appears in the manuscript with a note to this effect. The opposite also happens when, possibly as a result of scribal error, a differentia appears with 7 syllables or even more, perhaps where pitch grouping has gone awry. These are likely errors, but again, the assignation of these instances as errors is an interpretation of the data that should not be imposed upon future researchers. There are also some issues with the way differentiae were categorized in the Cantu's indices, as indexers labeled differentiae to varying degrees of specificity. Some indicated liquescent versions of a differentiae with an alphabetic suffix, differentiating between, for example, the one that you see on the top and the one on the bottom. Others named these two versions the same thing, so it's just D1 in mode 2. They're identical, unless you look at the manuscript. So for a standardized index, this variation in accuracy is problematic. So therefore, in cases where the indexer was not specific enough, I needed to revisit the manuscript more extensively than my 5-check rule in order to capture these variants. Essentially, the Diferencia project takes a previously crowdsourced field and standardizes it so as to improve access to a particular aspect of the Cantu's database, the Diferencia. The next step is to complete the index for the remaining manuscripts. I've done 100 and started some more, but it's not done yet. And then once it's completed in Excel, the database needs to be integrated into the Cantu's database and converted into an online interactive format. This last step will consist of 2 parts. First, a field should be added to existing antiphon records, which includes the standardized unique identifier. Then an online interface needs to be developed for the Diferencia index so that researchers can explore relationships between differentiae. This interface should be interconnected with the data that is already available on the Cantu's database so that researchers can also analyze relationships between differentiae and antiphonal melodies, texts, liturgical feasts, manuscript provenance, etc. Finally, future manuscript indices should incorporate the standardized naming system at the point of their completion so as to avoid retrospective indexing. Ultimately, the goal of the Diferencia index is to provide a tool to answer, or at least to investigate, those unanswerable questions that require large amounts of data and therefore cannot be addressed in manual comparisons of a few manuscripts. For instance, the questions that have been raised in previous studies but never really answered include whether there are geotemporal networks or families of differentiae, whether concurrences between differentiae in different modes and modal systems indicate a pre-modal organization of antiphons that use differentiae, whether there is a connection of the choice of between the choice of differentiae and the melodic or textual content of the associated antiphon. They used to think this very clearly, but it has since been sort of debunked. For manuscripts that use the same differentiae, are they associated with the same antiphons and feasts? What was the role of differentiae in the organization of the liturgy and performance? And finally, just why are there so many of them? It is my hope that the standardized Diferencia index, once complete and accessible in an interactive online interface, will allow scholars to answer these questions, or at least to explore them with more data than was ever previously possible.